If you want to turn in your pew Bibles to page 37, we'll read this together. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept loudly, so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. And then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant of earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me today. Do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks and your herds and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." And then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. Last week, we started this series on the history and origins, I guess, of Israel. We didn't go all the way back to Abraham, but we did touch on Abraham's son Jacob. And we mentioned how God changed Jacob's name into Israel. Yes. We started last week actually with the story of Jacob's 2 wives, 2 handmaidens, and the 12 sons he had by them, and how ridiculously dysfunctional that family was. Jealousy had a huge hold on that family, and it led to 11 of Jacob's sons ganging up on Joseph and selling him to slave traders who eventually took him to Egypt. So here's something that you need to know about these stories. And you're probably going to say, "Jesse, why are you going here?" But really, in order to figure out how we fit into this, I needed to give you this background. These stories about Israel's origins, they were part of a larger work that is called the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's called the Torah. And most scholars believe that these books were actually produced in what we call the Babylonian captivity, which is when most of Israel's religious and civil leaders were hauled off to Babylon because Babylon had conquered them. They were all hauled off and taken to the capital in Babylon 600 years before Christ. And all of these ancient stories about creation and and how the nation came together. All these stories were brought together in one volume during the 60 years that they were held in captivity there. And so, here, a lot of people ask the question, okay, well, why were these civil and religious leaders hauled off to Babylon like that? And here's the answer to that. It's because that's how Babylon kept peace in the empire. They figured if they took the movers and shakers out of their homeland and brought them to Babylon, the likelihood of them rising up and causing trouble was minimalized. And here's the deal. They weren't cruel to them when they brought them to Babylon. In fact, they wined and dined them and hoped that they'd say, wow, we have it better here in Babylon than we ever did in Israel. Let's stay. That's what they wanted them to think. But leave it to the faithful religious leaders and the prophets to challenge folks when they get a little too comfortable and start forgetting their faith heritage. And that's why we have the Torah. That's why the Torah was produced during this time, to remind people who they are and to whom they belong. Okay? So here's the tie-in. The passage we read last week and the passage we read this morning sets the stage for the defining moment in Israel's history, and that is this prelude to Israel being enslaved in Egypt. And then after that, you've got the Exodus, which is the Ten Commandments, Prince of Egypt, whatever movie you watched that was about. We won't even talk about Exodus, Gods and Kings. That was such a horrible movie. But anyway, these people were not just captive in Egypt, like the folks in Babylon. They weren't just captive, they were slaves. And it all started with these 11 brothers who sold their 17-year-old sibling into slavery because he was daddy's favorite. See how the ball can get rolling on some of these things? That's what happened. And what the brothers did not factor in was that Joseph was one of these people who could fall in a bucket of muck and come out smelling like a rose. You know people like that, don't you? And you wonder about them. So even though Joseph started out as a slave in Egypt, even though he had a traumatic experience in the first household where he served as a slave, Joseph eventually earned the trust of some very powerful leaders in Egypt because he was gifted in interpreting dreams. He had dreams and he interpreted other people's dreams. And so by the time Joseph was 30, the Pharaoh in Egypt trusted him so much that he let Joseph govern all of Egypt. And as it turns out, Joseph was a pretty savvy leader. He dreamed about these famines that would hit the whole area, that whole area in the Middle East there. So he started storing up all of this grain in Egypt to make it through this famine that he dreamed about. And so when all the surrounding territories in Egypt got hit by this famine, all these surrounding territories went to Egypt. All the people went to Egypt in hopes that they could get some of this stored up grain so that they wouldn't perish. And Canaan, which is where Papa Jacob, Israel, and the 12 sons, minus Joseph, where they lived, that place was hit especially hard by this famine. And so Jacob sent 10 of his sons to Egypt to see if they could rustle up some grain. But Jacob, he kept Benjamin back. He just sent 10 of the brothers because he was afraid that if something happened to those other 10 brothers, that he wasn't going to have a son to carry on his name. So he kept Benjamin back. So the other brothers, they set out for Egypt to ask the governor of the land if they could buy some grain. Can you see where this story's heading now? Remember last week when I was talking about Dallas and Dynasty? Here's where it gets interesting, right here. Here's where it becomes like a primetime soap opera. because when they got there, when those brothers got there, they did not recognize that the governor was their brother Joseph, whom they had sold into slavery. Because they hadn't seen him since he was a 17-year-old kid. But let me tell you, Joseph recognized them, and he was not happy. And so he accused them of being spies, and he threw them in jail. And he said, you know what, I'm not going to let you out of this jail until one of you goes back to Canaan and brings your youngest brother here. Because he wanted them all in a place of vulnerability here. He was mad. So the brothers, they were freaking out over this, and they pleaded with Joseph, okay, but at least let us buy some grain and bring it back to Canaan so that our people don't starve. And Joseph let them cook in jail for a couple of days. And then he said, okay, listen up. I will let you take some grain back to Canaan, but I'm keeping one of you here until you bring back your youngest brother. And so the other brothers, they agreed to this, and they went back to Canaan to deliver the grain and bring back Benjamin. And they brought Benjamin back, and Joseph threw him in jail too because he was mad. But he also started feeling some sympathy because he overheard Reuben, the oldest brother, tell the others, you know why this is happening, don't you? You know why this is happening. It's because of all those horrible things that we did to our little brother Joe. And this is where we pick up. This is where we pick up this morning. Because finally, Joseph cracks and he reveals his identity to his brothers. Now, can you imagine how those brothers felt when this governor who had all this power over them, when they realized, oh my gosh, this is little Joe. This is our brother who we did all these horrible things to. They were speechless. They were scared. They couldn't even answer Joseph when Joseph said, hey, is our dad still alive? They were so scared. So did Joseph have his imperial guard kill them on the spot? No. Did he have his brothers thrown in jail so that they could rot there for the rest of their lives? No. You know what he did? He forgave them. He forgave them. And on top of that, he said, listen, don't feel bad about what happened. Had you not sold me into slavery, I wouldn't be in a position of power here to help you through this famine. All of this has occurred so that lives can be saved. This is a God thing. And we can be thankful for everything that's happened so far, even the bad things. Now, you talk about somebody who can make lemonade out of lemons, right? And I think this story is about God's faithfulness to Joseph. When you go back and read Joseph's story from the beginning, you can see how this faithfulness is kind of woven throughout the whole story from the very beginning. And this particular part of Joseph's story is especially important because this is when the light bulb goes off in Joseph's head. This is when he has this epiphany moment because he's been through all sorts of terrible, unspeakable things. He was separated from his parents. He was sold into his slavery by his jealous brothers. He was accused of adultery in the first house that he served as a slave. And then he was thrown in jail. He was abused. All of these things, horrible things that happened. But in all of the craziness that happened, God had a hand on Joseph. God had a hand on Joseph. Now, I don't believe that God ever causes things to happen. If you don't believe me, read the books of Job and Ecclesiastes. They have commentaries on that. I do believe that God works really hard in our hearts to help us recognize the good even in bad situations. So, in this moment, when Joseph finally faces his brothers, finally has them in a position where he wanted them vulnerable and all that, that light bulb went off and he said, oh, I see how God has been working here. God led me here so I can save my brothers' lives. And so it's a brilliant moment of realization, because he recognizes that even though his brothers did this terrible thing to him, he has an opportunity for reconciliation. And he has it standing right there in front of him, literally. He has the opportunity to save them even though they tried to kill him. He's been given this chance to show his brothers and everybody else what God's forgiveness looks like and feels like. Now, verse 8 is probably the most quoted verse from this passage. Joseph says to his brothers, "So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." Now, I think sometimes we can use a verse like this to justify the idea that God made this happen to Joseph, and that God made his brothers sell Joseph into slavery, or God caused all these terrible things to happen so that, somehow we can all learn a lesson. I honestly don't think God works that way. But was God at work in this story, though? Absolutely. Every single step of the way. Because see, we can look at this whole thing from two different angles. We can say, well, I thank God that he placed this door in front of me alone, because I'm so special, and because I've been so good and faithful. But then we got to be careful here, because this is how those health and wealth TV preachers get your money. All right, work with me on this. They'll say, if you do all these things, if you don't drink, smoke, or chew and hang out with those who do, and if you give X% of your income, God will move heaven and earth and cause all sorts of great things to happen for you. And if you put a little extra in the plate and support this particular social issue or this candidate, then God will put an extra hedge of protection around you against all sorts of calamity that might otherwise happen to you. See how this can be problematic? Okay, so what about the person who's been taught this all their lives and who has done all the right things but then still faces tragedy? How are they going to feel? Or we could look at this whole thing from another angle. This is how we might be able to look at it. We can acknowledge that we live in a cause and effect world where bad things happen to good people sometimes, and sometimes good things happen to bad people. But God's work happens in us. When we can recognize and be thankful for the blessings that come our way, rather than believing that somehow God has suspended all the laws of nature just for us and for our benefit. And to heck with anybody else who might be negatively affected from said suspension of nature. And so when we look at verse 8, it's not like Joseph is telling his brothers, "Oh, don't worry, you didn't send me here, and you're not responsible for your actions. It was all God." No, the brothers did wrong. The brothers sinned against him, no doubt. And it was a bad thing. But I think what Joseph is saying is, you guys had no idea that I was going to end up here when you sold me into slavery. You had no idea that I was going to become a ruler in Egypt. But isn't it peculiar? Isn't it good that it all worked out the way it did? Thank God for that. Thank God for leading all of us to this moment in time where repentance and reconciliation can take place and lives can be saved. So, can you see now how this story could be a comfort to those Jews who were being held captive in Babylon? Don't despair. God is with us in all circumstances. It was true during the very earliest chapters of our history, and it is true now. God is faithful. The story can be a comfort and assurance to us, too. We who are sitting here in 21st century world, right here in this sanctuary, it can be assurance to us, too, because we are, after all, descendants in faith, part of this same crazy dysfunctional family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and his brothers. And you know what? I know there's a lot of people who are feeling captive right now. Maybe like the exiles in Babylon. A lot of us are reluctant to even turn on the news in the morning now, right? And we ask, why is God doing this to us? And we're coming up with all sorts of weird theories about why, too, which aren't healthy. See, I don't think God is doing anything to us. But God is present in and among us. And God can and will work through people's hearts so that repentance and reconciliation can take place and so that lives can be saved.